There's a growing vocal movement that seeks to tax the rich, an idea that socialists have had since their philosophy's inception. One prominent voice on YouTube looks at it more from the view of taxing assets, but also doesn't seem to be against raising income tax, as it's frequently stated that the UK had higher taxation on individuals in the 50s and 60s. Seemingly a good idea on paper, squeeze wealthy people to plug shortfalls in government funding. But is it really the answer? You have to look beyond the hyperbole to work out if this could be a viable policy or just another ill-judged, flawed proposition. There have been a number of proposals in different areas like capital gains and assets, but for the sake of this video, I'll only be looking at income tax for brevity. I'll try to stay on that topic as much as possible, as the whole issue is far too broad to cover now. But if I stray onto other related taxes, I'll attempt to not dwell on them too much, maybe another time. Obviously, I can't go in complete depth of the topic. I'll be here for hours, so apologies if I miss key points. Feel free to make a case in the comments for and against. So income tax is one of the new kids on the block as far as taxes go. I won't go into a complete history, but it was generally only wealthy people that actually paid any form of taxes up until the beginning of last century. The First World War took its toll on finances, so governments chose to take a more broad approach. And so modern income tax began its steady rise to a point just after the Second World War, and again in the 60s, where you could be caught in a system of over 100% taxes, believe it or not. The surtax, or super tax, that George Harrison famously sang about in the Beatles song Taxman, is based on levels where you could see yourself paying tax on up to as much as 90 to 95% in some instances. These levels were brought down in the 70s and gradually settled to what they are today. So what do we pay tax for? Well, obviously for the nation's infrastructure, welfare, health services, schooling and education, amongst various other things. As a comparison to Europe, here is a visual representation of what people across Europe were paying back in 2022. A situation that has changed a fraction for a few countries, but mostly the levels are broadly the same as now. Notice Denmark's eye-wateringly high level, along with several big countries like France, Spain, Sweden and Finland. There are some that say we should have a wealth tax on top of this for the super wealthy. And whilst that term is a bit vague, I think generally people could say that it's for those earning in excess of £1 million, which is a good place to start, though I've seen that it's been mooted at a level of £10 million plus. It's hard to tell as different groups have different ideas of the starting level. So one proposed wealth tax of around 2% could generate approximately £24 billion apparently. That's not an insubstantial sum, and it's almost 8% of the total welfare bill of the estimated £302 billion the state will spend on welfare in the current tax year. This would be appealing to a lot of people that earn a tiny fraction of the wealthy, as they view it as an injustice that people earn so much more than they do. And it's the ideology behind the rationale that interests me. It seems almost like a fine or punishment, so that poorer people have some form of retribution for the injustice of some having tremendous earning power. Which leads me to my first question. Is it morally okay for people who work hard to have nearly half their earnings taken from them? Taxation levels cause arguments, however you view them, and for some, it's the price you pay, literally, for the ability to earn those sums. The social economic disparity in the UK causes people less well off to resent rich people, regardless of how they gain their money. There's a conversation to be had about those who have generational wealth, or old money as we used to call it, and how that wealth is handed down, but that's a topic for another time. Most of these subjects are interlinked, but focusing solely on income, most of the super rich do not even draw regular income. They take assets, stocks, shares, etc., rather than a traditional salary. But you do get some perceived high earners, and this is a problem for some. In the UK, we don't celebrate wealth and success, we sneer at it, and this is where tall poppy syndrome comes in. Tall poppy syndrome being people's innate suspicion of anyone who gains more success, of whatever variety, in whatever they do, and often a desire for them to have less success, so they're on a par with most everyone else. This extends to people who outperform and out-earn in this scenario. The working classes despise the rich, and here, once someone has grown taller than the average normal person, they're more likely to be figuratively cut down to size, to be the same as everyone else. Our class system, history, and slightly left-leaning viewpoints on this makes us prone to this phenomenon, which isn't particularly helpful and attempts to stifle those who have the ability to do better. Something deep down people recognise that they are just not as capable as some others, but it's a really bitter pill to swallow. Obviously, some things are down to luck. It could be a right place, right time thing in some cases. If we've seen with a lot of ordinary people who've become famous, maybe, or they have a talent people might perceive isn't useful or they're not particularly skillful. But tall poppy syndrome, unfortunately, is a real thing. And circling back to the taxation, it means a lot of people want to tax the rich into oblivion because of this. Now, there are obvious drawbacks to this in modern society, the way we've set things up. Generally, the wealthy are drivers of the economy. The top 1% earners also pay nearly 30% of all income taxes, which has gradually crept up since the 90s, partially as there are more wealthy people now. Income tax brought in 277 billion in 2023 to 2024, so approximately 80 billion of that was from the highest earners. Adding the previously mentioned 24 billion from the proposed wealth tax would see the highest earners paying over a third of the income tax revenues as a whole. And as there's such a tiny amount of people, this seems pretty disproportionate. But apparently half the country supports this due to the aforementioned thinking. Now, some say if you start imposing extra taxes, then the wealthy elites would go somewhere where the taxation was lower. This is possible, though how much of an effect it would have is debatable. The fear is that if the richest took their wealth with them, it could affect the economy. And this is partially true. If these people have businesses that, for example, they decide to relocate elsewhere that is overall more tax friendly, there might be the case that multi-billionaires also who feel they're better off somewhere else could go. The biggest concern is those that actively drive the private sector through either investment or having companies that employ people would go. But they wouldn't actually be able to take certain assets with them, like property, and while some companies could relocate, others would have to sell brick and mortar stores, for example. Now, who they sell to would be the key, as the money going to an overseas investor is far less ideal than a UK-based company, for example. It is a complex web, and unfortunately people do not want to discuss the nuance of the UK economy that is so reliant on importation of foreign goods and labour, and where not a great deal of things are homegrown, produced or created, apart from in the financial sector. Would more tax make people quit the UK? There's definitely been some cases. Would it devastate the economy? Probably not, but it could have an impact. Especially as people forget that if the rich live here, whilst they might spend money elsewhere also, they are also going to spend money here, lots of it, which benefits us hugely if they purchase goods and services here. A lot of that money stays in the economy. Not to mention, if loads of rich people left, the tax revenue would drop significantly. It doesn't benefit us on the whole, just the country that they might relocate to. But going away from the financial implications to a more moral focus, is it right to take so much away from people in the first place? Surely, rather than impose more taxes on people, we should be seeking to reduce tax for those less well off and rein in the out-of-control spending. Some people argue we need to raise more taxes to pay for the NHS, for example, but we actually don't. We don't get nearly enough value for money from the NHS, and even Labour has admitted this now by scrapping NHS England. The whole governmental system is bloated, and you could easily raise far more than what's being proposed by the wealth tax by just having a proper efficiency drive with no loss of real services in all areas of government. But as far as deductions from the public go, once you've factored in the myriad of other indirect taxation, the proportion that people lose to taxes is far too high. And for what? This is a second question that goes across the board and something that people possibly overlook. Regardless if you're paying a small amount of tax on minimum wage, or a higher amount where you're earning past the 50k threshold and on the 40% tax bracket, or to the huge amounts that you pay when you earn huge amounts, no one is getting value for money. Keeping on pumping money into the system hasn't resulted in us being able to get doctors or dental appointments any easier, or have buildings and infrastructure upgraded and improved. It's now getting to the point where the state is just like a giant money pit. And logically, it doesn't make sense for richer people to pay more for essentially the same service. Taxes are supposed to go towards maintaining infrastructure, defence, well-being of people who have difficulty looking after themselves, etc., etc. If you earn more, you pay more to contribute towards this, but you don't necessarily get more from it, which doesn't seem particularly fair and means basically the rich are subsidising people's lives. You could argue that because they have more, they require more from infrastructure, but actually most of their costs would be paid to private companies, surely, especially for things like bills. So yes, they might use more, but they will pay more. As a rich person, you're not getting a higher level of service from the government just because you give them more. That's not how it works. Additionally, wealthy people could take less out of the system as they would probably use private services, doctors, hospitals, dentists, for example. Now, counter to that, there are some rich people that do take up some resources, like police protection if they're famous, but I'm talking more about the type of people that are not in the public eye. Someone who could be an NHS consultant on 150k, who's paying nearly 40% of their earnings to income tax and NI alone, probably isn't drawing any more from government services than someone on far less. It's an interesting way of looking at things, and we seem to have the view that you earn more, you pay more, regardless of whether that actually makes any logical sense. Another issue, if we're talking about fairness, is the amount of people who take more from the state than put in. It's an uncomfortable subject for some, and people will rush to their defence, no doubt. But whilst we're talking about taxation, having millions unemployed or not active or whatever you wish to call it puts pressure on the system, as there's less tax revenues from those people, but more benefits to be paid. On an individual basis, you can justify some people's situations, but zoom out and look at the broader picture, and that gets harder. A wealth tax would be far easier to implement than getting millions into work, and for any government, they're generally not looking to the future, only their term in office, and they want the easy win. Getting even 2 million plus people into full-time employment would generate far more than the proposed wealth tax, but we couldn't possibly actually do the right thing for the country and those people now, could we? Going back to the tax receipts graph, corporation tax looks low considering the economy as a whole is worth trillions. We could just change the tax system and tax on turnover, not profit. Controversial, I know, but there are many ways to change the overall structure without compromising the need to retain businesses here in Britain and prevent capital flight, etc. When just shy of 8,000 companies in the UK are turning over £2.1 trillion, 1% of this is 21 billion, which is almost as high as this proposed wealth tax. You could easily have a slightly higher surcharge on those companies that takes the money at source without the need to go after individuals, as I think that would be a fairer system. I would say we could also look at lowering the bottom level of income tax to 10%. So if you're a member of the public and you're on a low wage, but you use public services, you pay something like 10%. Shift the 20% band to over £50,000 a year. Make the top level income tax 30% for those earning more than 125,000. Then you can look at matching those bands in corporation taxes at an appropriate level of revenue. You could also then scrap NI contributions to anyone earning the top level, but have them not use any NHS services whatsoever other than A&E, effectively forcing them to go private, saving money there, though I imagine some of them would already be private if they got paid that much anyway. But it's an option. No one seems to come up with any other argument for taxing richer people more than because they earn more or because they have more. I'd love to hear a persuasive argument other than this, as it just sounds like a punitive measure thought up by people who have less and cannot attain more. Fairness is another reason, the argument being that higher earners pay a lower proportion of their wages than someone who earns considerably less. So you can see here, someone who earns minimum wage pays less than 10% in tax and NI, yet someone earning nearly 5 times that amount at 125k doesn't pay 5 times the amount of tax, only 4 times as much, which critics of this system point to as the unfairness. But again, is someone getting value back from the state at 4 times the value, let alone 5? That doesn't make sense. Or are we merely asking the wealthy to bankroll all of us, to be looked after by those who have more? We do that to a certain degree in society at ages where we rely on others for support, or claiming benefits using money paid by everyone earning. Is that the basis of fairness in which we're looking at this? I'm not sure that's right, when we should be looking after ourselves, being in gainful employment. If the only basis for higher personal income taxation is because we should, then it seems to be the politics of envy. But I don't see how you even things this way. People like to complain about things being top down. Well, this is a similar principle. cut the head off of the poppy to match the height of the others. Surely it's better to encourage people to grow and help those at the bottom. There is so much wrong with society, and I understand people's need to try to level the playing field somewhat, but unfortunately that's really never going to happen. There's very little fairness in life, and forcing it isn't the answer. But today's idea of equality drives the narrative, so we end up looking at all these things through this lens, even if the basic concept is flawed. Of course, richer people should not avoid taxes, but the conversation about what is a fair amount needs to come before what people feel is an appropriate amount, as we shouldn't be making policy on feeling when it comes to a subject that is all about maths. And just as an aside, our value-added tax isn't that at all and shouldn't be paid on anything in a weekly shopping trolley. Really, this should be, as it's titled, a tax on goods with significant value. So one way you could potentially tax rich people more, some could argue, could be to impose a more significant rate of VAT on only luxury items costing over a certain high value. Though again, this would seem a little like a punitive measure against the more prosperous. But there is a broader discussion regarding government spending and what we get taxed on in general. The taxation we have now should be reformed with an emphasis on getting more corporate taxes, not personal. Wealth inequality is a real issue, but looking at it through a lens of rich people bad really isn't the right way to go about tackling the problem. Reining in spending should be the first thing to focus on. After that, we should switch our attention from individuals or look at how assets could be taxed in a more appropriate way. Another answer could be to look at how we rein in huge multinationals and corporations and not allow companies to have so much power, wealth and influence, though the fear of many is that we are actually now too late for that. So yeah, what are the arguments for taxing the rich and the wealthy? Full disclaimer, I am not rich.